September 1994, a remote corner of a national park about 90 miles from Sydney. David Noble, a park ranger, is walking his usual route and stops by a creek to grab a bite. He looks up and notices unfamiliar treetops overhead, almost 130 feet tall, with bumpy bark and needles that look more like fern leaves. After years on the job, he knows every tree here, but he can't tell what this one is. He breaks off a small branch and tucks it into his backpack to identify it home. Noble doesn't yet know that he's holding a branch from a tree that science believed had been extinct for 2 million years. The branch is shown to botanists, and no one can say what tree it is. The specialists go back to that same corner of the park, collect bark and cones, and slowly realize what they're dealing with. They named the tree the Wollemi pine, after the park where it was found. No human being had ever seen it alive. It was known only from prints pressed into ancient stone. When dinosaurs walked the Earth, trees like this stood in whole forests. Then an asteroid hit the Earth, and the planet went through one of the worst extinctions in its history. About 3/4 of all life vanished. The dinosaurs didn't survive. The Wollemi pine did, and it held on for tens of millions of years more, until, as science believed, it finally disappeared long before the first humans. And now, several dozen of these trees were quietly growing in a park just a couple of hours from a modern city. That alone would have been enough to call the find the discovery of the century. Scientists were holding a living witness to times that left nothing but fossils. The logical thing would have been to show it to the whole world. Run tours, make it a sensation, put up a plaque with the discoverer's name. Instead, the tree was hidden so well that no one would ever find it. The first thing they did was classify the exact location. The canyon's coordinates were never made public. Even today, only a small circle of people knows them. Not just anyone can reach the trees. Only someone granted personal permission. And even with permission, you can't simply walk into the grove. Before going down, a person puts on sterilized footwear and changes clothes. For any harm to these trees, the law threatens a fine of up to $220,000 and 2 years in prison. And hundreds of surveillance cameras stand in the bush around the grove. Nature, though, had been guarding these trees long before people. They grow at the bottom of a narrow gorge you can only reach by rope, and that gorge had sheltered them for tens of thousands of years. But even that seemed too little to the scientists, and on top of nature's defense, they locked the place down like a secret laboratory. At first glance, the explanation seemed obvious. They were protecting the last tree from tourists, so it wouldn't be stripped for souvenirs. And yet the real reason was different. In 2005, the thing the scientists feared most happened. Someone made it into the closed canyon, and soon, a water mold that attacks roots was found on the wild trees, a rot that kills a tree from the inside. And it's easy to bring in. A clump of wet soil stuck to the sole of a boot is enough. Death had almost entered this tree's last home. It had survived the dinosaurs, the ice ages, millions of years, and now it was dying from a mold people carry on their boots. Something didn't add up, but the mold made one thing clear. There was no more time to wait. So while some guarded the grove, others took on a second task, just as important. They began propagating the tree in a hurry, not studying it, but copying it, fast and in large numbers, as if the original might vanish any day. And the Wollemi pine seemed to meet them halfway. Normally, to grow a conifer from a cutting, you have to treat the cut end with a special hormone, or it dries out. Here, no hormone was needed at all. The cuttings took root on their own, 8 out of 10. And you could take dozens of them from a single tree without hurting it. What happened next didn't sit well with all that secrecy. To save the country's most guarded tree, they put it up for sale. In 2005, the first saplings went to a public auction, and a plant you couldn't even approach without permission could now be bought by anyone. Copies went out to botanical gardens around the world, and at Kew in London, the first young trees were kept behind bars at first, like a museum treasure. The thinking was simple. Let the tree grow on hundreds of other properties in dozens of countries, and then trouble in one canyon won't kill it off completely. The original was guarded above all else, while copies were deliberately sold all over the world. And still, a question remained. If the tree had been propagated by the thousands and planted across the globe, why cling so desperately to a handful of trees in a wild gorge? As if without that tiny grove, everything else lost its meaning. Here's why they clung to it. The Wollemi pine has a trick that carried it all the way to our time. An ordinary tree lives as long as its trunk lives. The trunk dies, and the tree dies. The Wollemi pine works differently. When an old trunk dies off, a new one rises from the same root, then another and another. On a single tree, they counted more than 40 trunks, and they all grow from one common root. It's essentially one plant that regrows itself again and again. So the age of a Wollemi pine can't be measured by its trunk. A trunk as thick as your arm may live about 350 years, but the root beneath it is far older. Some of these roots may be as old as the Egyptian pyramids. Such a tree is hard to kill. Break its trunk, burn it, let the wind topple it. The root pushes out a new one, and life goes on as if nothing happened. That's exactly how the Wollemi pine survived everything that came down on its gorge over thousands of years. But this immortality has a limit. It saves a single trunk, a single tree. Against a disaster that hits the whole grove at once, the root is powerless. The Wollemi pine learned to cheat the death of a trunk, but it never learned to cheat the death of the whole species. A tree that's almost impossible to kill one at a time turned out all at once to be one of the most vulnerable species on the planet. Why became clear when they compared the genes of the trees from the canyon. And there were very few of them, fewer than 60 grown trees on the entire planet. All the samples turned out to be identical without the slightest difference, no matter how many they checked. What grew in the canyon wasn't a forest. All the Wollemi pines at the bottom of the gorge are clones, copies of one single plant, repeated dozens of times. The same life over and over. It happened because long ago the species nearly died out. Tens of thousands of years ago, only a few Wollemi pines were left, maybe just a handful of trees. The species survived and regrew itself from the few that made it, but it could never get its old variety back. And every tree today became a descendant of that tiny handful, clones with almost identical genes. This explains everything that looked like paranoia from the outside. The sterilized footwear, the classified coordinates, the copies on other continents. Not overcaution, but cold calculation. When all the trees are identical, they share one weakness. A disease that kills one will kill all the rest because they're defenseless against it in exactly the same way. That's why a clump of soil on someone's boot could end a story 200 million years long. For an ordinary forest, a disease is a misfortune, but for this one, it's a death sentence for the whole species at once. The scientists understood that a single outbreak would be enough to wipe the Wollemi pine off the planet forever, and all they could do was hope it wouldn't come to that. Then, in 2019, a threat came to the canyon that no sterilized footwear or cameras could stop. It was coming from the sky. Australia was swept by the worst fires in its modern history. The season remembered as the Black Summer burned through whole regions one after another. One of those fires, started by a lightning strike, grew to monstrous size and moved toward the national park, where the last wild grove of Wollemi pines lay hidden in its secret canyon. Before it could be stopped, the fire burned through more than 1.2 million acres, an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. The scientists faced the choice they had feared for 25 years. Everything they had done until now protected the trees from people, from a dirty soul, from other hands, from prying eyes. Against a wall of fire, it was useless. Leaving the grove to chance meant almost certainly losing it, since a single major fire, as they had long understood, would be enough to wipe out the whole species. So they launched an operation like nothing ever done to save trees before. Aircraft were sent to the secret canyon. Heavy planes dropped fire retardant around the grove, laying a protective ring right in the middle of the wild forest. Firefighters were lowered by helicopter to the floor of the gorge, where they set up sprinkler systems to soak the ground and force the flames to pass low without flaring up into the crowns. Every rescuer, from the pilots to the firefighters at the bottom of the canyon, was sworn to keep the location to themselves. They were saving the grove, but its coordinates were still kept hidden. Then the fire came. It entered the canyon, and for 4 days the grove disappeared behind a wall of smoke so thick that no one could say whether a single trunk was left standing, whether the defense had worked, whether the trees had held, whether anything living remained there at all. The gray haze hid it all, and all they could do was wait. On January 15, 2020, the smoke finally cleared, and the teams could finally go down to the grove. The result was almost unbelievable. Out of the entire wild population, the fire killed only 2 trees. A few more were scorched, and the rest held on. The defense had worked. The Volemi pine survived even this. It could have ended far worse, and the scientists had prepared for that turn in advance. Several years before the Black Summer, they had secretly planted young Volemi pines in another wild spot, a second grove, an insurance policy in case something irreversible happened to the first. And when the fire came, it was that backup planting that burned nearly to the ground. The ancient secret grove, guarded for a quarter of a century above all else, was saved, while its stand-in, planted for exactly such a case, died. The copy didn't save the original. On the contrary, the original held on where the insurance failed. The lesson was harsh. The Volemi pine was defended, but only at the cost of a military-scale operation, of helicopters, of people who risked themselves in a burning gorge. Next time, the fire might come faster than help could arrive. Saving the species once and for all still hadn't happened. It had only been pulled back from the very edge again. After the fire, it became completely clear the old protection wasn't enough. No matter how well the canyon was hidden, one wild grove and one backup planting were too thin a thread to hold an entire species on. Had the disaster gone just a little differently, there would have been nothing left to save. So the strategy was changed for good. If before they had protected the Volemi pine by hiding it from everyone, now they decided to protect it the opposite way, by spreading it out, but smartly. In 2023, they launched what was meant to be a real safety net for the species. More than 170 young trees, chosen to capture what little variety was still left, were sent out to dozens of botanical gardens in different countries and on different continents. They were planted in different climates, in different soil, deliberately scattered across the world so that no single disaster could ever reach them all at once. A fire in one place, a disease in another, a drought in a third. Whatever happened, somewhere the Volemi pine would still survive. A species that for thousands of years had clung to one single canyon finally had many homes across the planet. Time passed, and the trees planted around the world back in the mid-2000s began to mature. And then, in the fall of 2025, something people had waited decades for happened in one of Britain's botanical gardens. It was a special year. The Volemi pines there produced an unusually rich crop of cones for the first time. Instead of the usual 20 to 30 seeds a season, they collected 168. And for the first time, those seeds were placed in the world's largest seed vault for wild plants, in case they're ever needed to bring the species back. It might sound like an ordinary garden story, but behind it was the turn that made this whole journey worth it. All this time, the Volemi pine had been saved by copying, cuttings, clones, thousands of identical trees, all with the same genes, all with the same weakness. That kind of propagation preserved the species, but changed nothing in it. A copy stayed a copy, just as defenseless against any threat. A seed works differently. In it, the genes mix anew, and what comes out is not a copy, but a new combination. The very variety the Volemi pine lost tens of thousands of years ago, the variety without which it was so vulnerable. And now the tree that was thought extinct for 2 million years, the tree that a single stranger's boot nearly sent to the grave, is producing offspring unlike its parents for the first time. A species locked in its own genetic trap, longer than whole civilizations have existed, is slowly starting to climb out of it. Not on its own, by the hands of the people who once hid it in a secret canyon, and then, instead, spread it across the whole planet so that it might finally have a future.